So my name's David Duke, and I teach here in the Department of History and Classics and also in the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program at Acadia. And the most common question that I get asked by students, especially after some of my lectures, is, why do you keep doing this? Isn't it totally depressing to be involved in this kind of thing? And my response is no. Actually, the reason why I keep doing this is because of all of you in the room in front of me. I mean, what keeps me going and what gives me hope for the future are the students that come through these programs and that are committed to making a difference in the environment and to improving our environmental stewardship and improving our relationship and changing our relationship with the environment. I would say that what's given me the most hope in the last little while is more people have been in the streets marching for the climate in the last 6 months than in the previous 10 years. I think we're definitely at a tipping point now, and I'm really excited by that. I'm not frightened by it. I think this is a real moment where we're going to move forward. I think it was Winston Churchill. I'm going to paraphrase Winston Churchill. He said something like, democracy is the best form of government. Democracy is the worst form of government except when you compare it to all the others. And I feel that we're a little bit like that as a species. We eventually come to the right choice, but only after we try all the wrong ones. And I think that that's where we are today. We're starting to come to the right choice finally. There's an election going on at the moment, and I think every single party would like it to be about anything other than the environment, and yet the voters are pushing everybody to talk about the environment as the number one issue, which is thrilling for the Greens. And so I'm really excited, and I'm really hopeful for the future. I can take my kids to demonstrations, and they can add their voices to the calls for change. They have an incredible role model in Greta Thunberg, somebody that they can look up to from their own age group roughly, who's not an adult, who's somebody who speaks their language, speaks with their voice. And as a consequence, we're seeing tremendous change just beginning to happen right now, and I think that this is a moment of tremendous hope. So, that's what I would say in terms of our relationship to the environment in a big way. Personally, I mean, my relationship to the environment is one of the ocean, I think. My family, my dad was a sailor. I grew up by the ocean. I moved to Canada when I was 14 and settled in the prairies, which was about as far away from the ocean as you could get. And I lived there for a number of years and really loved it. The mountains, we were very close to the Rockies, and that was an incredible place to experience as a late teenager in my early 20s. But moving here, moving to Nova Scotia felt like coming home because it was moving back to the sea. And for me, there's no more amazing place than that ribbon of life between the land and the sea along the shoreline. It's the most interesting, incredible, rich, wonderful place you could ever possibly want to be. As an academic, one of the things I would say is we always talk about the books that matter to us. And of course, many people point to a book like Silent Spring and Rachel Carson's ability to kind of open up our eyes to real challenges. Well, I absolutely adore Rachel Carson, but for a completely different book. A book that she wrote probably 10 years before Silent Spring. It's a little book called The Sea Around Us, and I actually have it on my bookshelf just over there. It's a book that opens up your eyes. It was written to open up the eyes of the entire population of the United States to the wealth and the wealth of diversity and complexity that are found along shorelines, and as these kind of dividing points between two worlds of land and sea. And it's a really romantic book, I won't lie, but it's also full of science. And I read that book when I was a teenager, and that got me really hooked on the idea that whatever we do regarding our relationship to the environment, whatever policies we come up with, while we have to focus on our cultural requirements, we also have to base it on science. This idea that the science isn't fixed on climate change, or that we don't really understand our relationship to the universe, to nature, that's simply not true. Of course we do. The science tells us many, many different ways that we should build our relationships with nature, foundations upon which we can build. Of course, we can have differing interpretations of those relationships. We can emphasize culture or the arts or our human, personal, spiritual relationship to the environment. Those are all important. But at the foundation is a scientifically driven understanding of the world and our relationship to it. And I think a program like Environmental Studies does that. We connect very closely to environmental science. Our students are able to kind of bridge a whole range of ideas and come up with their own new ideas about their relationships to the environment. And that's, to bring this full circle, that's the last thing that gives me hope as well. The attitudes and the perspectives of students when they leave this place and when they fan out into the world and make the difference that we all know is necessary and that we as professors here know that they're entirely capable of doing.
Will you talk about... I'll edit this later. That was awesome.
Okay.
Will you talk about that? How do you think like people being out in nature is something that drives them to want to do something for it?
Sure. Yep. I can absolutely do that.
And maybe about like when we were in class, there was that time that you were talking about how trees, like, or different like plants in forest connect and like help other plants in the forest.
Yeah.
If you could talk about that.
Sure, I can absolutely do that. So one of the most important things for me as a historian who teaches both history and environmental studies is the importance of story. I teach a world history course, and in world history there's two ways to learn it. You can take the textbook and you can learn a whole bunch of individual facts, and that's actually really hard to do. It's really hard to put all of those things together. But if you treat history like a story, like where everything links to everything else, all of a sudden a group of first-year students that think there's no way they can learn 1,000 years of history, when I tell them, you've read Harry Potter, you know all of the bits and pieces of Harry Potter, you know all of the tiny details because they all fit together as a story. And when I see students realize that if they treat history as a connected narrative, then it all makes sense to them. The same is true for nature. If we look at nature as a series of discrete little things that we have to kind of bring into a laboratory and push everything else away and just study that one little thing, we miss the point of nature, which is its connectedness. And the cutting edge of science, to me, as it relates to our natural world, is the science that looks at the connections in nature. So the way in which a forest can send signals to itself. If a tree or a series of trees are being attacked by an infestation of caterpillars, the way that they can release chemicals either through their root systems or even through the air to warn other trees that this infestation is coming, and those trees then respond by producing chemicals in their leaves which make them unpalatable to the caterpillars so that the caterpillars will not eat those leaves. Those kinds of connections among trees and plants that are supposed to not think and not react to their environment, just grow in it, tells us that our environments are inextricably connected with a web of life. And when we are in that web of life is when we are most attuned to it ourselves, because the greatest mistake I think we've made as a species, and I think this is as a historian thinking, the greatest mistake we've ever made is to separate ourselves from nature, to make ourselves either above it or separate from it, because that impoverishes us. It makes us isolated, it makes us small. But when we're in nature, think about all the people, perhaps you might be watching this yourself, think about your own experience with nature where you have that moment, that connection with something bigger than yourself. Some people who believe call that a connection with the divine. They call that a connection with God or a God. Other people say that it's a connection with the spiritual foundation of their existence. Whatever they call it, it is undeniably true that when one is in nature, one feels more connected to the world, feels more at peace with one's place in the world. I know of nobody who goes out into nature, even for a short period of time, who does not come back more rested, more focused, more challenged by the world around them and more energized by it. And so I always tell students as well, my students, I say, if you're feeling tired, don't go for a coffee with your friends, go for a walk on the dikes, go down by the ocean, go for a walk in the forest, experience nature, and you'll come back refreshed. That wonderful word, refreshed, that's what we get in nature, a spiritual refreshment. And to me, that's absolutely crucial in our relationships.
And That's awesome. Are you comfortable talking about how you hug trees?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And just like kind of how you think they feel, or like the earth kind of thing.
Yeah. I have two children, a 13-year-old boy and an 11-year-old boy, and I embarrass them when we go for walks with our friends. One of the great things about living around here is there's lots of places to get into nature. There's lots of places to go for walks with your family, with your friends, and I hug trees. I love hugging trees. The gracefulness of a silver birch, or the strength and power of an elm or an oak, you can feel it right the way through the bark. And even if there's no evidence that the tree feels it, I like to believe that the tree connects with me. If I connect with nature, then why wouldn't nature connect with me? And to say thank you, to recognize the existence of the spirits in those trees, is something that's incredibly important to me. As I say, my kids think I'm crazy, but I suspect also that at some point they will grow up and become tree huggers themselves. It's a good thing to be.